The rain came down in sheets that Tuesday afternoon, turning the quiet country road into a ribbon of silver. Sarah Martinez pulled her old sedan to the side, squinting through the downpour at the black luxury car sitting motionless ahead. Steam rose from under its hood, and a tall figure in formal uniform stood beside it, phone pressed to his ear. She hesitated for just a moment. Her shift at the hospital had been exhausting, and all she wanted was to get home, kick off her shoes, and collapse on the couch. But her father had raised her better than that. He always said that kindness costs nothing, but can mean everything to someone in need. Sarah grabbed her emergency kit from the trunk and jogged toward the stranded vehicle, her nurse's scrubs already soaked through. As she got closer, she noticed the pristine red uniform with gold braiding, the polished boots, and the military bearing of the man who now turned to face her. He was young, maybe in his early 30s, with sharp features and dark eyes that seemed surprised to see her approaching. "Do you need help?" she called out over the sound of rain drumming on metal. The man lowered his phone, and she caught a flash of relief crossing his face. "My car overheated. I've called for assistance, but they're saying it could be over an hour in this weather." Sarah nodded and moved closer to examine the engine. Years of growing up with a mechanic father had taught her a thing or two. She popped the hood fully open and immediately spotted the problem. A hose had come loose, nothing too serious if dealt with quickly. "Do you have any water in the car?" she asked, already rummaging through her emergency kit for the roll of industrial tape she always kept. "There's bottled water in the back seat," he replied, watching her with a mixture of curiosity and uncertainty. As Sarah worked, securing the hose and carefully adding water to the radiator once it had cooled enough, she felt his eyes on her. She was used to people underestimating her. At 5'3" with a round face that made her look younger than her 28 years, people often dismissed her capabilities until she proved them wrong. "You know what you're doing," he observed. And it wasn't quite a question. "My dad owned a garage," Sarah explained, wiping her wet hands on her already drenched scrubs. "I spent every summer there as a kid. You pick things up." She stood back and gestured to the car. "Try starting it now. It should run, but you'll want to get that hose properly replaced soon. This is just a temporary fix." The man slid into the driver's seat and turned the key. The engine roared to life smoothly, no longer coughing or smoking. He stepped back out, and for the first time, Sarah saw him smile. It transformed his entire face, making him seem less intimidating and more human. "I cannot thank you enough," he said, and there was genuine warmth in his voice. "You've saved me from a very uncomfortable wait." "May I at least know the name of my rescuer?" "Sarah Martinez," she replied, returning his smile. "And it's really no problem. Just glad I could help." He extended his hand for a formal handshake. "I'm James Wellington." As their hands met, his gaze dropped to her left hand, and Sarah saw his expression shift. His eyes fixed on the simple gold band on her ring finger, and something flickered across his face that she couldn't quite read. Disappointment? Surprise? It was gone before she could be sure. "You're married," he said, and it came out almost like a statement requiring confirmation. Sarah's hand instinctively moved to touch the ring, a habit she'd developed over the past 2 years. "Yes, I am." An awkward silence stretched between them, broken only by the steady rhythm of rain. James seemed to be studying her face as if trying to memorize it, which made Sarah feel oddly self-conscious. "Well, I should let you get home to your family," he finally said, stepping back toward his car. "Thank you again, Mrs. Martinez. You've been incredibly kind." Sarah nodded, suddenly eager to leave this strange encounter behind. "Drive safe. And remember about that hose." As she hurried back to her car, she couldn't shake the feeling that something significant had just happened, though she couldn't put her finger on what. She glanced in her rearview mirror as she pulled away and saw James still standing beside his car, watching her leave. The drive home gave her too much time to think. She absently twisted the ring on her finger, a gesture that had become almost unconscious. The band felt both comforting and heavy, a constant reminder of promises made, and a future that had taken an unexpected turn. When Sarah finally pulled into the driveway of her small rental house, the rain had lessened to a drizzle. She sat in the car for a moment, staring at the dark windows. The house would be empty, as it always was these days. No warm lights greeting her, no smell of dinner cooking, no arms to fall into after a long day. She touched the ring again, and this time, tears mixed with the raindrops on her face. The gold band represented a marriage that existed only on paper now, a legal tie to someone who was no longer part of her daily life, but she kept wearing it, perhaps out of habit, perhaps out of hope, or perhaps simply because taking it off would mean accepting a reality she wasn't quite ready to face. Sarah gathered her things and headed inside, unaware that the man in the Royal Guard uniform was already making calls about the mysterious woman who had stopped to help him, unaware that her simple act of kindness had set into motion a chain of events that would challenge everything she thought she knew about duty, honor, and what the heart truly wants. The ring on her finger held secrets that even Sarah didn't fully understand yet. And James Wellington, despite that ring's presence, couldn't seem to stop thinking about the kind stranger with capable hands and a warm smile who had appeared like an angel in the rain. 3 days passed before Sarah saw James Wellington again, and the circumstances were entirely different. She was wheeling a medication cart down the corridor of St. Mary's Hospital, mentally reviewing her patient list, when she heard a commotion near the emergency entrance. Security personnel were taking positions, and the hospital administrator was smoothing down his tie nervously, while speaking in hushed tones with the head nurse. Sarah's curiosity got the better of her, and she moved closer to see what was happening. "The royal family is visiting today," whispered Monica, one of the other nurses. "Some charity thing. They do it every year, but this time they're bringing the actual guards with them. Very fancy." Sarah's stomach did an unexpected flip. Surely it couldn't be the same person. Royal Guards weren't that uncommon, and James was probably a popular name. She tried to focus on her work, but her attention kept drifting to the main entrance. When the delegation arrived, Sarah found herself in the break room, watching through the window as a small group entered the hospital. There were photographers, officials in suits, and yes, 2 guards in formal uniform flanking an elderly woman who moved with practiced grace despite her age. And there, standing at attention, was James. He looked different in the full ceremonial uniform, more imposing and untouchable. But it was definitely him. Sarah felt her cheeks warm as memories of their rain-soaked encounter flooded back. She should return to her rounds. There was no reason to linger here like a schoolgirl. Yet she stayed, watching as the royal party made their way through the hospital, stopping to speak with patients and staff. The elderly woman, whom Sarah recognized as the Duchess of somewhere she couldn't quite recall, had a kind smile that seemed genuine rather than practiced. "Sarah Martinez." A voice behind her made her jump. It was Mr. Patterson, the hospital administrator. "Could you come with me, please? The royal delegation has specifically requested to meet some of our nursing staff." Her heart hammered as she followed him down the corridor. This had to be a coincidence. There was no way James would have asked for her specifically. He didn't even know where she worked, but when she entered the conference room where select staff members were gathered, James's eyes found hers immediately. There was recognition there and something else she couldn't quite identify. He stood slightly behind the Duchess, maintaining his professional composure, but Sarah saw the slight upturn at the corner of his mouth. The Duchess spoke graciously to each staff member, thanking them for their service to the community. When she reached Sarah, she paused, studying her with sharp, intelligent eyes that seemed to see far more than they should. "You're a nurse here?" the Duchess asked, her voice carrying the weight of aristocratic breeding. "Yes, Your Grace," Sarah replied, hoping she'd used the correct form of address. "I work in general medicine." "How wonderful. The healthcare workers are the true heroes of our society." The Duchess's gaze flickered briefly to Sarah's left hand, and Sarah saw her eyebrows raise almost imperceptibly. "Married, I see. Does your husband work in medicine as well?" The question caught Sarah off guard. It seemed oddly personal for such a formal occasion. "No, Your Grace, he's in the military. Stationed overseas." It wasn't entirely a lie. Michael had been in the military when they married. What Sarah didn't mention was that he'd been deployed for 18 months now, and their last real conversation had been over 6 months ago. What she didn't say was that the marriage had been crumbling long before he left, and his deployment had simply made the inevitable separation easier to bear. The Duchess nodded thoughtfully. "Military families make such sacrifices. You must be very strong." After the delegation moved on, Sarah tried to slip away, but a hand gently touched her elbow. She turned to find James standing closer than protocol probably allowed. "I didn't know you worked here," he said quietly, his formal demeanor softening. "When I saw your name on the staff list, I thought it might be you." "So you did ask for me to be here," Sarah said. not quite able to keep the accusation from her tone. James had the grace to look slightly embarrassed. I wanted to thank you properly. The other day you helped me without expecting anything in return. That's rare, especially for someone in my position. Anyone would have done the same, Sarah protested, but they didn't. Several cars passed me before you stopped. He paused, seeming to struggle with something. I've been thinking about that encounter. About you, Sarah's breath caught. This was dangerous territory. She was a married woman, even if that marriage existed mostly in name only, and James was clearly someone important, someone far above her social standing. You shouldn't say things like that, she whispered. I'm married and you're— I know, James interrupted gently. I know you're married, but I also know that when I asked about your husband you looked sad. Sadness isn't what I'd expect from someone in a happy marriage. Sarah felt exposed, as if he'd seen through the carefully maintained facade she presented to the world. My personal life isn't your concern. You're right. I apologize. That was inappropriate. James stepped back and the formal guard returned, replacing the man who had been speaking to her with such warmth. Thank you again for your assistance the other day, Mrs. Martinez. I hope our paths cross again under better circumstances. He turned to leave, but Sarah found herself speaking before she could stop herself. Wait, I didn't mean to be rude. It's just complicated. James looked back at her, and in his eyes she saw understanding mixed with something that looked like longing. Complicated is something I understand very well. My entire life is built on complicated. Before she could respond, another guard called for James, and he had to leave. Sarah stood alone in the corridor, her mind racing. What had just happened, and why did the thought of never seeing James again make her chest feel tight? That evening, as Sarah sat alone in her quiet house, she finally did something she'd been avoiding for months. She pulled out her phone and looked at the last message from Michael. It was brief, impersonal, the kind of message you'd send to an acquaintance rather than a spouse. Deployment extended. Don't know when I'll be back. Take care. She'd responded with equal brevity, and since then silence. No phone calls on birthdays or anniversaries. No video chats or care packages. Just a ring on her finger and a name on a marriage certificate connecting them. Sarah twisted the band, feeling its familiar weight. For the first time, she wondered if wearing it was a comfort or a prison. Was she honoring a commitment, or was she hiding behind it, using it as an excuse not to move forward with her life? She thought about James's words, about the sadness he'd seen in her eyes. Was she that transparent? Or had he simply looked closer than most people bothered to? Her phone buzzed with a notification. An email from the hospital. The royal family was hosting a charity gala next month, and several hospital staff members were being invited to attend. Sarah's name was on the list. She stared at the invitation, knowing she should decline. Nothing good could come from seeing James again. But even as she thought it, her finger was already hovering over the accept button. Some part of her, the part that felt alive for the first time in years after their brief encounter, wanted to see where this path might lead, even if it was dangerous. The charity gala was held at the Grand Estate, a sprawling manor house that looked like something out of a period drama. Sarah felt completely out of place as she stepped out of the taxi, smoothing down the simple black dress she'd borrowed from her friend Monica. Around her, women glittered in designer gowns and jewels that probably cost more than Sarah's annual salary. She almost turned around and left right there. What was she thinking coming to something like this? She was a nurse from a working-class family, not someone who belonged in this world of champagne fountains and crystal chandeliers. But then she remembered the look in James's eyes when they'd spoken at the hospital, the way he'd seen past her uniform and her circumstances to the person underneath. Maybe she didn't belong here, but she'd been invited, and she'd never been one to back down from a challenge. The ballroom was magnificent, all soaring ceilings and golden light. Hospital staff clustered together near one side, clearly as uncomfortable as Sarah felt. She was making her way toward them when she spotted James across the room. He wasn't in his guard uniform tonight. Instead, he wore a perfectly tailored tuxedo that made him look even more handsome and even more unattainable. He was speaking with a group of older men who had the bearing of military officers or government officials, but his eyes kept scanning the room as if looking for someone. When his gaze landed on Sarah, everything else seemed to fade into the background. He excused himself from his conversation and began moving toward her, and Sarah's heart started racing in a way that had nothing to do with nervousness about the fancy party. "You came," he said when he reached her, and the genuine pleasure in his voice made her smile. "I almost didn't. This isn't exactly my usual scene." "Mine either, believe it or not." James glanced around the room with something that looked like distaste. "These events are part of the job, but I've never enjoyed them. Too much performance, not enough substance." "Then why do you do it?" Sarah asked. "Duty," James replied simply. "Family expectations. When you're born into certain circumstances, your path is chosen for you before you can even walk." There was something bitter in his tone that made Sarah curious. What would you do if you could choose? If duty and expectations didn't matter? James looked at her for a long moment, and Sarah felt like he was really seeing her, not just the surface, but everything underneath. "I'd probably do something simple. Maybe work with my hands, fix things, help people in practical ways. Something real. Like fixing cars on the side of rainy roads," Sarah teased gently. He laughed, a genuine sound that drew looks from nearby guests. "Exactly like that. Though I'd need someone to teach me properly. I only know the theory, not the practice." "I could teach you," Sarah offered, then immediately felt her cheeks warm. "I mean, if you wanted to learn. My dad's garage is still there, even though he passed away 2 years ago. I can't bring myself to sell it." "I'd like that very much," James said, and the sincerity in his voice made Sarah's breath catch. They were interrupted by the announcement that dinner would be served. As a guard, even one not on active duty tonight, James was expected to sit at the head table. Sarah was directed to a table with other hospital staff. But throughout the meal, she felt his eyes on her, and every time she glanced in his direction, he was looking back. After dinner, there was dancing. Sarah watched from the sidelines as elegant couples swept across the floor, moving with the kind of grace that came from expensive lessons and years of practice. She'd never learned to dance properly, not like this. "May I have this dance?" James appeared beside her, hand extended, and Sarah's pulse quickened. "I don't really know how," she admitted. "I'll probably step on your feet." "Then we'll step on each other's feet together," James replied with a smile that made her stomach flip. "Come on, I insist." Against her better judgment, Sarah took his hand. The moment he pulled her onto the dance floor and placed his other hand on her waist, she felt like the room had shrunk to just the two of them. He guided her through the steps with patience, and Sarah found herself relaxing into the rhythm. "You're a natural," James murmured, close enough that his breath tickled her ear. "You're a good teacher," Sarah countered, trying to ignore the way her body responded to his nearness. They moved in comfortable silence for a moment before James spoke again. "Can I ask you something personal?" Sarah tensed slightly but nodded. "Your husband, the one overseas. When was the last time you spoke to him?" Really spoke to him, not just exchanged messages. Sarah's first instinct was to tell James it was none of his business, but the gentle concern in his eyes made her honest. 8 months ago, maybe 9 now. He doesn't call, and when I try to reach him, he's always busy or unavailable. That must be very difficult. "It is," Sarah admitted, surprised by her own candor. "But honestly, I think we both know the marriage is over. We just haven't had the courage to say it out loud. The distance makes it easier to pretend everything's fine, that we're just waiting for the right time to reconnect. But deep down, I know we're not going to." "Why do you still wear the ring?" James asked, his eyes dropping to her left hand where it rested on his shoulder. Sarah had asked herself that question 1,000 times. "I guess because taking it off feels like giving up, like admitting failure. My parents were married for 40 years before my dad passed. I always thought I'd have that kind of marriage, the kind that lasted forever. Letting go of that dream is harder than wearing a piece of metal that doesn't mean much anymore." "It's not failure to recognize when something isn't working," James said softly. "Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is acknowledge the truth and move forward. Is that what you'd do?" Sarah challenged. "If you were in my position?" James was quiet for a moment, his hand tightening slightly on her waist. "If I were in your position, and if I'd met someone who made me feel alive again after years of just going through the motions, I'd seriously consider what I wanted my future to look like. I'd ask myself if holding on to the past was worth missing out on what might be possible." Sarah's breath caught. They both knew he wasn't speaking hypothetically anymore. "James, we can't do this." "Can't do what?" he asked, though his eyes said he knew exactly what she meant. "Whatever this is. You're a royal guard. I'm a married nurse. We live in completely different worlds. Nothing about this makes sense. You're right, James agreed. It doesn't make sense. But that doesn't change the fact that I haven't been able to stop thinking about you since that day in the rain. That doesn't change the way I feel when you smile at me, or the way you made me laugh tonight for the first time in months. The song ended, and they stopped moving, standing frozen on the dance floor while other couples swirled around them. Sarah felt like she was standing at a crossroads, and whichever path she chose would change everything. I need some air, she said finally, pulling away from James even though every part of her wanted to stay in his arms. She made her way to the terrace, gulping in the cool night air. The garden stretched out before her, illuminated by tiny lights strung through the trees. It was beautiful and romantic, and Sarah felt tears pricking at her eyes. She heard footsteps behind her and knew without turning that it was James. He came to stand beside her, not touching but close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him. I'm sorry, he said. I shouldn't have said those things. You're married and I have no right to complicate your life. My life is already complicated, Sarah replied, still staring out at the garden. My marriage has been falling apart for years. Michael and I got married too young for the wrong reasons. We thought we loved each other, but really, we just liked the idea of not being alone. And then he deployed. And the distance gave us both an excuse not to deal with our problems. She turned to face James, and in the soft light from the garden, his face was open and vulnerable. But you're right about one thing. Taking off this ring means admitting all of that. It means accepting that I failed at the most important promise I ever made, and that terrifies me. You haven't failed, James said firmly. Sometimes things just don't work out no matter how hard you try. That doesn't make you a failure. It makes you human. Sarah looked down at the ring on her finger, really looked at it for the first time in months. It suddenly felt heavy, like a chain rather than a symbol of love. And she realized that James was right. She'd been hiding behind this ring, using it as protection against feeling anything real, against taking risks that might lead to more pain. But she'd already been in pain for so long that she'd almost forgotten what anything else felt like. Until James looked at her with those dark eyes and made her feel seen in a way she hadn't experienced in years. The week following the gala was the longest of Sarah's life. She threw herself into her work at the hospital, taking extra shifts and volunteering for the most difficult assignments. Anything to keep her mind off James and the dangerous feelings he'd awakened in her. But no matter how busy she kept herself, she couldn't stop replaying their conversation on the terrace. She couldn't forget the way he'd looked at her, or the truth in his words about her marriage. She'd been living in limbo for so long, neither fully committed nor fully free, and it was exhausting. On Thursday evening, Sarah finally did something she'd been avoiding. She called her mother in Arizona, the one person who would tell her the truth even if it hurt. Sarah, honey, what's wrong? Her mother asked immediately. Maria Martinez had always been able to read her daughter's moods even over the phone. I need to talk to you about Michael, Sarah began, her voice already shaking. About my marriage. There was a pause and then her mother sighed. I've been wondering when you'd finally bring this up. You haven't mentioned him in months, and every time I ask, you change the subject. It's over, Mom. It's been over for a long time. I just haven't wanted to admit it. I know, Mia. I think I've known for a while. Her mother's voice was gentle, without judgment. What's changed? Why are you ready to face it now? Sarah hesitated, wondering how much to share. I met someone. Not in a romantic way, not really. But he made me realize that I've been settling for a life that makes me miserable. I've been wearing this ring like armor, protecting myself from having to make any real decisions. And this someone, does he make you happy? Her mother asked. Yes. No, I don't know. Sarah laughed, but it came out bitter. I barely know him, Mom. But when I'm with him, I feel like myself again. It's like the person I was before everything with Michael got so complicated. Then you need to be honest with Michael, her mother said firmly. Not because of this other man, but because you deserve to live your life truthfully. You're 28 years old, Sarah. You have so much life ahead of you. Don't waste it pretending to be in a marriage that died a long time ago. That night, Sarah sat down and wrote an email to Michael. She'd tried calling, but as usual, he didn't answer. The email was honest and painful and long overdue. She told him that they both knew the marriage wasn't working, that the distance between them was about more than just miles. She suggested they talk seriously about their future, about whether there was anything left worth saving. She hit send before she could change her mind. then sat staring at the screen for an hour, waiting for a response that didn't come. The next day, Sarah was surprised to receive a delivery at the hospital, a small package addressed to her with no return address. Inside was a book about classic car restoration and a note in elegant handwriting. I meant what I said about wanting to learn. If the offer still stands, I'd like to take you up on those lessons. No expectations, no pressure. Just two people working on something real with their hands. James. Sarah's hands trembled as she held the note. This was dangerous. She was still technically married, even if that marriage existed mostly on paper. Getting closer to James was asking for complications she didn't need. But when had she last felt this excited about something? When had she last looked forward to anything beyond just getting through another day? She pulled out her phone and texted the number written at the bottom of the note. Saturday afternoon, 2 o'clock. I'll text you the address. His response came almost immediately. I'll be there. Saturday arrived too quickly and not quickly enough. Sarah spent the morning cleaning up her father's old garage, which sat behind the house she'd grown up in. Her mother had moved to Arizona after her father's death, but Sarah had kept the property, unable to let go of the memories contained in its walls. The garage smelled of motor oil and old metal, familiar and comforting. Sarah had spent countless hours here as a child, handing her father tools and listening to him explain how engines worked. After he died, she'd locked the door and tried to forget, the grief too raw to face. But now, preparing the space for James, she felt her father's presence in a good way, like he was giving his approval. James arrived exactly at 2, dressed in jeans and an old t-shirt that made him look younger and more approachable than his formal uniform or tuxedo ever had. He carried a paper bag that smelled like fresh coffee and pastries. I brought provisions, he said with a smile. I figured if I'm going to be a terrible student, the least I can do is provide good snacks. Sarah laughed, feeling some of her nervousness fade. You're probably not as terrible as you think. Come on, I've got the perfect project for us. She led him to an old pickup truck tucked in the corner of the garage. It had belonged to her father, and it needed a new carburetor and some minor repairs. Nothing too complicated, but enough to teach the basics. As they worked, Sarah found herself relaxing completely for the first time in years. James was a quick learner, asking intelligent questions and not afraid to get his hands dirty. They talked about everything and nothing, sharing stories from their childhoods, their dreams, their fears. My father wanted me to take over the family business, James said as he carefully removed a bolt Sarah had pointed out. But I wanted to serve, to do something that mattered. So I joined the Guard. It was a compromise. I got to serve, but in a way that kept me close to the family expectations. Do you regret it? Sarah asked, watching him work with surprising dexterity. Sometimes. The uniform opens doors, but it also closes them. People see the position, not the person. Until you. He looked up at her, grease smudging his cheek. You saw me as just James, someone who needed help with a broken-down car. You are just James, Sarah said softly. The rest is just what you do, not who you are. They worked in comfortable silence for a while, the only sounds the clink of tools and the distant hum of traffic. Sarah was showing James how to reconnect a fuel line when her phone buzzed. She glanced at it and felt her stomach drop. It was an email from Michael. Finally, after days of silence, he'd responded. Everything okay? James asked, noticing her expression. It's from my husband, Sarah said, setting down her wrench with shaking hands. I wrote to him earlier this week about us. About the marriage. Do you want to read it now? I can give you privacy, James offered, already starting to stand. No, stay. Sarah surprised herself with the request, but she realized she didn't want to face Michael's response alone. She opened the email and began reading aloud, her voice barely above a whisper. Sarah, you're right. We've both been avoiding this conversation for too long. I think we got married for security, not love. At least not the kind of love that lasts. I care about you, I always will, but we're not meant to be married to each other. When I get back stateside next month, we should talk about divorce. I think we'll both be happier once we're honest about what we want. I'm sorry it took us this long to admit the truth. Sarah lowered the phone, feeling tears stream down her face. They weren't tears of sadness exactly, but rather a release of years of tension and pretending and holding on to something that had died long ago. James moved closer, and without asking permission pulled her into his arms. Sarah let herself be held, let herself feel the strength and warmth of someone who genuinely cared about her well-being. Are you okay? He asked when her tears finally slowed. I think so, Sarah replied honestly. It hurts, but it's also a relief. Does that make sense? Perfect sense, James assured her. Sometimes the truth hurts even when it's necessary and right. Sarah pulled back and looked up at him. I need to be clear about something. I can't jump from one relationship into another. I need time to figure out who I am outside of being someone's wife. I need to heal. I understand, James said, though she could see the disappointment in his eyes. I'm not going anywhere, Sarah. Take all the time you need. But I'd like you to keep coming here, Sarah continued. Keep taking lessons. Keep being my friend. Can you do that? James smiled, a genuine expression that reached his eyes. I'd like nothing more. Friends who restore old trucks together. I think your father would approve. I think he would too, Sarah agreed, looking around the garage that suddenly felt less like a monument to grief and more like a space full of possibility. She reached down and slowly, deliberately, slipped the ring off her finger. It had left a thin white line on her skin, a temporary mark that would fade with time. She placed the ring in her pocket, not throwing it away but removing it from its place of prominence. That's a big step, James observed quietly. It's time, Sarah said simply. Past time, actually. I'm not doing this for you, James. I'm doing it for me. Because I deserve to be honest about my life. You do, James agreed. And for what it's worth, I think you're incredibly brave. They returned to working on the truck, and Sarah felt lighter than she had in years. The road ahead would be complicated. There would be lawyers and paperwork and difficult conversations. There would be judgment from people who didn't understand. There would be questions about James and whether something inappropriate had happened. But Sarah knew the truth. She was ending her marriage because it had already ended, not because she'd met someone new. James had simply been the catalyst that forced her to acknowledge reality. What might or might not develop between them in the future was... The months that followed were both difficult and liberating for Sarah. Michael returned stateside in November, and they met at a quiet coffee shop to discuss the divorce. It was surprisingly civil, both of them relieved to finally stop pretending. They'd grown into different people than the young couple who'd gotten married 6 years ago, and they both deserved the chance to find happiness elsewhere. The divorce proceedings were straightforward since they had no children and few shared assets. By January, Sarah was officially single for the first time in her adult life. She felt unmoored at first, uncertain of who she was without the identity of wife attached to her name. But she also felt free in a way she hadn't experienced since her early 20s. Throughout it all, James kept his promise. Every Saturday afternoon, he showed up at the garage in his worn jeans and old t-shirt, ready to work on whatever project Sarah had planned. They finished restoring her father's pickup truck, then moved on to a vintage motorcycle someone had donated to the garage. James proved to be a natural mechanic, patient and methodical in his approach. But more than that, he became Sarah's closest friend. They talked about everything during those long Saturday afternoons. James shared stories about growing up in a family where duty and obligation came before personal happiness, where every choice was scrutinized and judged. Sarah talked about her grief over losing her father, her guilt about the failed marriage, her dreams of maybe opening the garage as a real business someday. They carefully maintained boundaries. No romantic gestures, no dates that could be misconstrued as more than friendship. Sarah needed time to heal, and James respected that completely. But the connection between them deepened with each passing week, built on genuine understanding and shared interests rather than just attraction. Sarah's co-workers at the hospital noticed the change in her. She smiled more, laughed easier, seemed lighter somehow. Monica, her closest friend at work, cornered her one day in the break room. "Okay, spill it," Monica demanded. "Who is he?" "Who is who?" Sarah tried to play innocent, but her cheeks were already warming. "The guy who's put that glow on your face. And don't try to deny it. I've known you for 5 years and I've never seen you look this happy." Sarah hesitated, then decided her friend deserved the truth. "His name is James. We're just friends, nothing more. But he's been helping me through the divorce and I've been teaching him about car repair. It's nice having someone to talk to who gets it." "Just friends," Monica repeated skeptically. "Is he single?" "Yes, but it's complicated. He comes from a very different world than I do. And even if he didn't, I'm not ready for anything serious. I need to figure out who I am on my own first." Monica studied her for a long moment. "Just be careful, okay? You have a good heart, Sarah, and I don't want to see it broken again." I'm being careful, Sarah assured her, though she wondered if that was entirely true. Every week she found herself looking forward to Saturday with an intensity that felt dangerous. Every time James smiled at her or laughed at one of her jokes, her heart did this little flip that had nothing to do with friendship. In February, everything changed. James arrived at the garage looking troubled, his usual easy smile replaced by a tight, worried expression. Sarah immediately set down her tools and moved to his side. "What's wrong?" she asked, touching his arm gently. James ran his hand through his hair, a gesture she'd learned meant he was stressed. "My family is arranging a marriage for me. Not legally arranged, but heavily encouraged. There's a woman, Lady Catherine, from a prominent family. They think we'd be a good match politically and socially." Sarah felt like someone had punched her in the stomach. She'd known this day might come. James had always been clear about the expectations placed on him by his family and position. But knowing it intellectually and facing it emotionally were two very different things. "What do you want?" she managed to ask, proud of how steady her voice sounded. "I want to choose my own life," James said, frustration evident in every word. "I want to be with someone who sees me as James, not as a title or a political alliance. I want what we have here in this garage where I can just be myself." "But you can't have that," Sarah said quietly, understanding dawning. "Your family won't allow it. They could allow it if I fight hard enough, but it would mean scandal, disappointment, probably being cut off from the family, and it would mean whoever I choose would be subjected to intense scrutiny and criticism. The press would dig into every aspect of their life, looking for dirt or scandal. It would be brutal." Sarah understood what he wasn't saying. He was asking if she would be willing to face that kind of pressure, if what they had was worth fighting for. But how could she answer when they'd never even been on a real date, when they'd carefully maintained the pretense of friendship, even as deeper feelings grew between them? "James, look at me," Sarah said, waiting until his dark eyes met hers. "I care about you, more than I probably should, given that we've been trying so hard to stay in the friend zone, but I can't ask you to give up your family, your position, everything you've known, for someone you've never even kissed." "Then let's change that," James said, stepping closer. "Let me kiss you, Sarah. Let's stop pretending that this is just friendship when we both know it's so much more." Sarah's breath caught. This was the moment she'd been both longing for and dreading. Once they crossed this line, there would be no going back to the comfortable safety of friendship. Everything would become complicated and real and potentially heartbreaking. But she was tired of being afraid, tired of playing it safe. The divorce had taught her that protecting yourself from pain also meant protecting yourself from joy. And James made her feel more joy than she'd experienced in years. "Kiss me," she whispered. James cupped her face in his hands, those hands that had learned to handle tools and fix engines, and kissed her with a gentleness that made her knees weak. It wasn't a passionate, desperate kiss, but rather something tender and reverent, like he was savoring something precious. When they finally pulled apart, Sarah was trembling. "That was worth waiting for," she said breathlessly. "It was," James agreed, resting his forehead against hers. "Sarah, I know the timing is terrible. I know we're facing impossible odds. But I need you to know that you're not just someone I'm considering. You're the person I want. If I have to choose between my family's expectations and a chance at real happiness with you, I choose you." "Don't choose yet," Sarah urged, even though her heart was singing at his words. "Meet this Lady Catherine. See if there's any possibility there. I don't want you to have regrets later, wondering if you gave up a good match because of a mechanic who taught you how to fix cars." James pulled back, looking almost offended. "You're not just a mechanic. You're brilliant and kind and brave. You face life honestly, without pretense or games. You've taught me more about being genuine in a few months than I learned in 32 years of formal education and training. I'm also a divorced nurse with student loans and a rented house," Sarah reminded him gently. "Your family is going to look at me and see someone completely unsuitable. Then they're not looking properly," James said firmly. "But you're right about one thing. I should meet Catherine, if only to be sure. I owe my family that much, and I owe you the certainty that you're my choice, not just my escape from duty." They agreed that James would attend the formal introduction to Lady Catherine that his family had arranged for the following weekend. They also agreed not to see each other until after that meeting. giving James space to consider his options without Sarah's presence clouding his judgment. The week that followed was agony for Sarah. She threw herself into work, but every quiet moment found her wondering what James was doing, what he was feeling, whether Lady Catherine was everything his family hoped she'd be. Maybe she was perfect for him. Maybe James would realize that marrying someone from his own world made more sense than choosing a relationship that would bring nothing but complications. Saturday came and went without a word from James, then Sunday. By Monday, Sarah had convinced herself that he'd made his choice and it wasn't her. She tried to tell herself it was for the best, that they'd had a lovely friendship and a single perfect kiss, and that was more than many people ever got. On Tuesday evening, she was just finishing her shift at the hospital when she saw a familiar figure waiting by the main entrance. James stood there in his full ceremonial uniform, looking every inch the royal guard. But when he saw her, his face broke into a smile that was pure James. Not the formal guard, but the man who'd spent months learning to fix engines in her father's garage. "I need to talk to you," he said as she approached. "Okay," Sarah replied, her heart hammering. "But maybe somewhere less public?" They walked to a small park near the hospital, finding a bench partially hidden by trees. The late winter sunset painted the sky in shades of pink and gold, and Sarah thought absurdly that this would be a beautiful setting for either the best or worst conversation of her life. "I met Catherine," James began, and Sarah braced herself for heartbreak. "She's lovely, exactly what my family wants. Educated, poised, from the right background. We had dinner together, and my mother and the Duchess were both beaming like they'd orchestrated the perfect match." Sarah felt her chest tighten, but she forced herself to listen without interrupting. James deserved to say whatever he'd come to say without her falling apart. "Catherine and I talked for hours," James continued, staring at his hands. "She's intelligent and funny, and under different circumstances, I think we could have been friends. But there was no spark, no connection beyond polite conversation. And the entire time I was sitting there, all I could think about was how much I wished I was in a garage with you, covered in grease and arguing about the best way to rebuild a transmission." Hope fluttered in Sarah's chest, but she kept her expression neutral. "What did you tell your family?" "I told them the truth. That I respect Catherine very much, but I don't love her and I never will. That I've met someone else, someone who makes me want to be better, who sees me for who I am rather than what I represent." James finally looked up at her, and his eyes were full of determination mixed with fear. "I told them about you?" Sarah's breath caught. "What did they say?" "My mother was disappointed. The Duchess was furious. They said I was throwing away my future for an infatuation, that I didn't understand what I was giving up." James's jaw tightened. "They gave me an ultimatum. End things with you and consider Catherine, or face being removed from my position in the guard and losing my place in the family business." "James, no," Sarah protested, grabbing his hand. "You can't give all that up. Your career, your family, everything you've worked for. Not for someone you've known less than a year." "But that's just it," James said, squeezing her hand. "I don't want the life they're offering if it means spending it with someone I don't love, pretending to be happy while dying inside. I've watched my uncle do exactly that for 30 years, trapped in a loveless arranged marriage, and he's the most miserable person I know. I won't become him. What about your position? Being a guard means everything to you. It meant everything to me because I thought it was my purpose, my way of serving and making a difference. But over these past months with you, I've realized that purpose can take many forms. I can serve people by fixing their cars, by teaching others what you've taught me, by living honestly and helping in practical ways." James smiled, though it was tinged with sadness. "You've shown me that there's more than one way to live a meaningful life." Sarah felt tears streaming down her face. "Are you sure? Really, truly sure? Because once you make this choice, you can't take it back. Your family might never forgive you." "I'm sure," James said without hesitation. "Sarah, I love you. I know it's fast and I know the timing is terrible, but it's true. I love the way you laugh when I make a mistake with the tools. I love how passionate you get when explaining how engines work. I love your kindness, your strength, your refusal to let circumstances define you. I love everything about you. And I want a life where I can wake up next to you every morning and fall asleep beside you every night." "I love you too," Sarah whispered, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. "I think I've loved you since that day in the rain when you looked at me like I was someone special. Not just another stranger on the road. James pulled her into his arms, holding her tight while she cried against his chest, happy tears this time, mixed with fear and excitement and the overwhelming weight of what they were about to face together. "There's something else," James said after a moment. "I resigned from the Guard yesterday, effective immediately, and I've put in an application to attend technical college, to formally study automotive repair. I want to do this properly, build a real career that I'm proud of." Sarah pulled back to look at him. "Where will you live? What will you do for money until you're trained?" "I have savings enough to get by for a while, and I was hoping," James paused, suddenly looking nervous, "that maybe I could rent the apartment above your father's garage. I noticed it's been empty. I could help you get the business running properly, maybe work as your assistant while I'm learning." "If you're willing to take me on," Sarah laughed through her tears. "You want to be my apprentice?" "I'd be honored to be your apprentice," James said seriously. "You're one of the best mechanics I've ever seen, and I have a lot to learn." The next few weeks were a whirlwind. News of James's resignation spread quickly through both the royal circles and eventually to the press. Headlines screamed about the royal guard who gave up everything for love. Photographers camped outside Sarah's house in the hospital, trying to get photos of the woman who'd supposedly led James astray. It was worse than Sarah had imagined. Reporters dug into her past, finding out about her divorce and somehow making it sound scandalous. Her ex-husband, Michael, was contacted, though to his credit he refused to make any inflammatory statements. Social media was vicious, with strangers who'd never met either of them passing judgment on their relationship and their choices. Sarah's co-workers at the hospital were mostly supportive, though a few made snide comments about her ambitions and her motives. Monica stood by her fiercely, running interference with reporters and threatening to call security whenever they got too close. James's family released a formal statement, expressing their disappointment in his choices, but wishing him well. Reading between the lines, Sarah understood it was their way of cutting him off without causing a complete public scandal. His mother sent a brief cold letter saying she hoped he knew what he was doing, and that the door would remain open should he come to his senses. Through it all, James remained steady and certain. He moved into the apartment above the garage, a modest space that he filled with second-hand furniture and books about engine repair. He enrolled in technical college and threw himself into his studies with the same dedication he'd once applied to his guard duties. Sarah reopened her father's garage as a legitimate business, Martinez Auto Repair. James worked alongside her, learning quickly and proving to have a real talent for diagnostics. Customers were initially skeptical about the former Royal Guard turned mechanic, but James's genuine humility and growing expertise won them over. They kept their relationship private at first, not hiding it but not putting it on display for the ravenous press either. They had dinner together most nights in the apartment, simple meals that they cooked together while talking about their days. They took walks in the park where they'd had that crucial conversation, finding peace in the ordinary moments that no one else cared about. 6 months after James resigned from the Guard, Sarah woke up on a Saturday morning to find him already awake, watching her with soft eyes. "What?" she asked, feeling self-conscious under his gaze. "I'm just happy," James said simply. "I know these past months have been difficult, with all the press attention and the judgment and the adjustments. But I've never been happier than I am right now in this moment with you. Even though you're living in a tiny apartment and your hands are always dirty and your family barely speaks to you," Sarah asked, needing to be sure. "Especially because of all that," James confirmed. "This life is real, Sarah. It's mine, not something that was chosen for me. Every day I get to make decisions about who I want to be and how I want to spend my time. And I get to do it with someone I love who actually sees me. That's worth more than any title or position or family approval." Sarah snuggled closer to him, feeling the truth of his words settle into her bones. They'd both given up versions of who they were supposed to be and gained something infinitely more valuable in return. They'd found themselves in each other, and they'd built a life based on honesty rather than obligation. "The press is saying you're going to regret this eventually," Sarah mentioned, voicing the fear that sometimes kept her awake at night, "that you'll resent me for taking you away from your old life. The only thing I'd regret is not having the courage to choose this path," James assured her. "Sarah, you didn't take me away from anything. You showed me there was another way to live. I made my choice freely with my eyes wide open. and I'd make the same choice 1,000 times over. Later that day, as they worked together in the garage on a classic Mustang that needed a full restoration, Sarah found herself thinking about how far they'd both come. A year ago, she'd been trapped in a failing marriage, wearing a ring that represented obligation rather than love, going through the motions of a life that didn't fit anymore. Now she was building something real, something that belonged entirely to her. The garage was thriving with more customers than she could handle alone. James was proving to be an excellent mechanic and an even better partner, someone who shared the load and celebrated the victories and stayed steady through the challenges. "Hand me the torquey wrench," James asked, and Sarah passed it over, their fingers brushing in the exchange. These were the moments she treasured most. Not grand romantic gestures or dramatic declarations, but the quiet partnership of two people working toward common goals. The way James listened when she explained a complex repair, the way he made her coffee exactly how she liked it without having to ask, the way he looked at her like she was the most fascinating person in the world, even when she was covered in motor oil and sweat. That evening, they had dinner with Monica and her husband, a double date that felt wonderfully normal after months of media attention. Over pasta and wine, they laughed about funny customer stories and made PL. 2 years had passed since that rainy afternoon when Sarah stopped to help a stranded royal guard. The media frenzy had eventually died down, replaced by newer scandals and fresher stories. Life had settled into a comfortable rhythm that felt both ordinary and extraordinary at the same time. Martinez Auto Repair had expanded, now employing 3 full-time mechanics including James, who had graduated from technical college with top honors. Sarah had been profiled in several automotive magazines as a successful woman business owner in a male-dominated field. She'd even been invited to speak at a career day at the local high school, encouraging young women to consider trades as viable career paths. James had found his calling in ways he never expected. Beyond his natural talent for mechanical work, he discovered a gift for teaching. He started offering free Saturday workshops for young people interested in learning basic car maintenance, turning her father's garage into a community hub. Kids from the neighborhood would gather to learn how to change oil, replace brake pads, and understand the machines that so many people took for granted. On a crisp autumn morning, Sarah was reviewing the week's invoices when she heard the bell above the garage door chime. She looked up to see an elegant older woman entering, and her heart nearly stopped. It was James's mother, Lady Victoria Wellington, dressed in a designer suit that probably cost more than Sarah's monthly revenue. "Mrs. Martinez," Lady Victoria said formally, though Sarah noticed she didn't use her title of lady. "I hope I'm not interrupting. I was hoping we might speak privately for a moment." Sarah's mouth went dry, but she managed to nod and gesture toward the small office. Her mind raced with possibilities, none of them good. Was James's family trying to buy her off? Threaten her? Convince her to leave him so he could return to his former life? Lady Victoria settled into the worn chair across from Sarah's desk, looking completely out of place in the utilitarian office. For a long moment, she simply studied Sarah, and Sarah forced herself to meet that examining gaze without flinching. "I owe you an apology," Lady Victoria finally said, and Sarah's jaw nearly dropped. "When James first told us about you, I made assumptions. I thought you were an opportunist, someone taking advantage of my son's moment of rebellion. I thought he'd eventually come to his senses and realize what he'd given up. And now?" Sarah asked carefully. "Now I've spent 2 years watching my son from a distance, reading articles about his work, hearing from mutual acquaintances about what he's doing, and I've come to realize that he's happier than I've ever seen him, that he's found purpose and meaning in a way he never did following the path we laid out for him." Lady Victoria's voice softened. "I've also realized that I valued position and propriety over my son's well-being, and that makes me a poor mother." Sarah didn't know what to say. She'd spent so long thinking of James's family as the enemy, obstacles to their happiness, that this vulnerability was completely unexpected. "James loves what he does," Sarah said finally. "He's brilliant with engines, but more than that, he's making a real difference with those kids he teaches. You should see how they look at him, like he's showing them possibilities they never considered before." "I'd like to see that," Lady Victoria admitted. "If you and James would allow it. I'm not asking to suddenly be part of your lives or expecting forgiveness for how we treated you both. But I'd like the chance to know this version of my son, the one who's finally living authentically. Before Sarah could respond, the garage door opened and James walked in, stopping short when he saw his mother. The wrench he'd been carrying clattered to the floor. "Mother," he said, shock evident in his voice. "What are you doing here?" "I came to apologize." Lady Victoria stood and Sarah saw her hands trembling slightly despite her composed demeanor. "To both of you. I was wrong, James. Wrong to try to force you into a life that wasn't yours. Wrong to judge Sarah without knowing her. Wrong to let pride and stubbornness keep me from my son for 2 years." James looked at Sarah, confusion and hope warring in his expression. Sarah gave him a small nod, letting him know this conversation was real and that she was okay with whatever he decided. "Why now?" James asked his mother. "What changed?" "Your Uncle Richard left his wife," Lady Victoria said quietly. "After 32 years of miserable marriage, he finally found the courage to pursue his own happiness. And when I saw him, really saw him for the first time in years, I realized he looked the way you used to look before you met Sarah. Trapped, going through the motions, and it broke my heart to think that I'd been pushing you toward that same fate." She took a shaky breath. "I've been a coward, James. Too worried about appearances and what people would think to admit that I was wrong. But I'm here now and I'm asking if there's any possibility you might forgive me. Not today, perhaps, but eventually." James was quiet for a long moment and Sarah could see him processing years of hurt and disappointment. She knew how much his family's rejection had wounded him, even though he rarely spoke of it. She also knew that part of him had always hoped for reconciliation, for his mother to see that his choice had been the right one. "I'm not the same person I was 2 years ago," James said carefully. "I can't go back to being that man and I won't apologize for the life I've built here." "I'm not asking you to," Lady Victoria assured him. "I'm asking if I can get to know the man you've become. On your terms, in your world, not mine." James looked at Sarah again and she saw the question in his eyes. This was her business, her space, her life too. He wouldn't invite his mother into it without her agreement. "You're welcome here," Sarah said, surprising herself with how much she meant it. "But you need to understand that we're not changing who we are or how we live to make you comfortable. This is our life and we're proud of it." "I wouldn't want you to change," Lady Victoria said, "and I'm proud even if I haven't shown it. Proud that my son had the courage to choose authenticity over obligation. Proud that he found someone who sees his value beyond a title. Proud of what you've both built here. The reconciliation wasn't instant or magical. Lady Victoria started visiting once a month, gradually becoming part of their lives in small, measured ways. She watched James teach his Saturday workshops, her eyes filling with tears when she saw how naturally he connected with the young people. She ate dinner with them in the small apartment, learning to appreciate simple meals and honest conversation over formal dining and political maneuvering. Slowly, other family members began reaching out. James's younger sister called, then visited. His Uncle Richard, newly divorced and finally living authentically, became a regular presence in their lives. The Duchess remained distant, too proud to admit she'd been wrong. But the isolation that had surrounded them began to lift. On a particularly meaningful day, James was under a car, explaining to a teenage girl named Maya how to identify worn brake pads, when Sarah's phone rang. It was a reporter from a major magazine asking if they'd be interested in being featured in a story about people who'd chosen passion over prestige. Sarah declined politely, as she always did with media requests. Their story wasn't about drama or scandal anymore. It was about the quiet satisfaction of building something meaningful, the joy of teaching and learning, the comfort of coming home to someone who truly knew you. That evening, as they sat on the apartment's small balcony watching the sunset, James pulled out a small box from his pocket. Sarah's breath caught, recognizing the moment for what it was. "I know we've been through a lot," James began, opening the box to reveal a simple, elegant ring. "And I know we've built a life together that doesn't need legal documents or ceremonies to validate it. But I want to ask anyway, because you deserve to be asked properly without secrets or complications or rings that represent the wrong things. Sarah Martinez, will you marry me? Not because of obligation or family pressure or fear of being alone, but because I love you and I want to spend the rest of my life as your partner in every sense of the word." Sarah looked at the ring, so different from the band she'd worn for years without joy. This ring represented a choice made freely, a commitment entered into with eyes wide open and hearts fully engaged. "Yes," she said, tears streaming down her face. Yes, I'll marry you. James slipped the ring onto her finger, and this time the weight felt right. Not a burden or a chain, but a symbol of love freely given and gratefully received. They were married 3 months later in a small ceremony at the garage, surrounded by friends, family members who'd come around, and the kids from James's workshops who insisted on being there. Lady Victoria sat in the front row, crying openly as she watched her son marry the woman who'd helped him find his true self. Sarah walked down the makeshift aisle between rows of vintage cars they'd restored together, wearing a simple white dress that let her be herself. There was no Royal Guard uniform, no formal titles, no pretense. Just James in a good suit, looking at her like she was his entire world. Monica stood as her maid of honor, and James's sister served as his best woman. The ceremony was short and heartfelt, focused on promises made between equals rather than obligations or duty. When the officiant pronounced them married, James kissed Sarah with the same tenderness he'd shown that first time in the garage, and the gathered crowd erupted in cheers. There were no